I embarked on a grueling 30-day experiment to determine if viral financial hacks could sustain life. These tips circulated on social media, promising stability for those living on a minimum wage budget. Armed with nothing but a detailed spreadsheet and a strict budget, I abandoned my usual comforts. I chose to embrace the extreme frugality so loudly championed by popular internet influencers online today. My days quickly became a blur of endless coupon clipping and searching for the best deals. I spent hours bulk buying dented cans of beans to stretch my limited resources as far possible. Navigating the sprawling city entirely on foot became necessary to save every cent on transit fares. I meticulously documented every single cent spent throughout the long, exhausting days of this intense challenge. Testing theories about dumpster diving for produce felt like a desperate act of survival each evening. I also evaluated the efficacy of living in a cramped shared room with 4 total strangers. The initial thrill of the challenge quickly faded as the harsh reality of systemic poverty set. It became clear that these viral tips were often superficial band-aids for deep-seated economic instability issues. By the end of the second week, the physical toll of constant scarcity began to mount. The mental fatigue of tracking every penny started to erode my resolve and my inner peace. I was forced to confront the harsh limitations of these digital shortcuts in my daily life. Every decision felt heavy, burdened by the constant need to prioritize survival over my personal comfort. The spreadsheet, once a tool of empowerment, now felt like a cage restricting my every movement. I watched the city pass me by while I walked, feeling the disconnect between me and others. Hunger became a constant companion, a reminder that my budget was far from being truly sustainable. The dented cans of beans provided sustenance, but they lacked the nutrition my body desperately needed. Sharing a room with strangers meant sacrificing my privacy and my ability to rest properly nightly. The influencers on my screen seemed so detached from the reality of this grinding, daily struggle. I realized that their advice ignored the hidden costs of time, health, and personal human dignity. Each step I took across the pavement felt like a testament to the failure of these hacks. The systemic barriers were far more rigid than any viral video had ever dared to suggest. I felt the weight of the world pressing down on my shoulders as the experiment continued. My bank account dwindled, leaving me with little room for error or any unexpected life expenses. The promise of financial freedom through frugality felt like a cruel joke played on the vulnerable. I questioned why I'd ever believed that such simple solutions could solve such complex problems. The experiment was no longer just a test, it was a deep dive into genuine hardship. I saw the faces of people who lived this reality every day without any exit strategy. My resolve wavered, but I pushed forward to see the experiment through to its bitter end. The digital world felt increasingly hollow, a facade built on engagement rather than actual human survival. I learned that poverty is not a puzzle to be solved with a clever budget spreadsheet. It is a structural condition that requires more than just individual willpower to truly overcome effectively. The silence of my shared room at night was filled with the sounds of the city. I contemplated the irony of my situation, playing at poverty while others lived it by necessity. Every cent saved felt like a victory, yet it was a victory that felt completely empty. I was exhausted by the constant calculations required to keep my head above the rising water. The experiment revealed the cracks in the foundation of our society that we often choose ignore. I felt the sting of judgment from those who saw my struggle as a personal failure. The reality of minimum wage was far harsher than any social media post could ever convey. I continued to document my journey, hoping that my findings would shed light on the truth. The physical exhaustion was matched only by the growing sense of frustration within my own mind. I had started this with optimism, but that was replaced by a somber, deep-seated, painful clarity. The limitations of my experiment were becoming painfully obvious as the days turned into weeks now. I was not just saving money, I was losing a piece of my own human spirit. The struggle for survival is not a game, and it is certainly not a viral trend. I looked at my spreadsheet one last time, seeing the numbers that define my current life. They told a story of scarcity, of missed opportunities, and of a life lived in fear. The experiment was a mirror reflecting the inequality that defines our modern, fast-paced digital world today. I felt the urgency of the situation, knowing that I could stop whenever I wanted finally. That realization alone was the greatest privilege of all, one I had not fully understood before. I walked through the city, seeing the same streets with a completely different, more critical perspective. The influencers were still posting, but their words now rang hollow and lacked any real substance. I knew then that my experiment was just a small window into a much larger problem. The systemic issues were deep, and they required a collective effort to address and fix properly. I was ready to end this charade and return to a life of more stable, real security. The lessons I learned would stay with me long after the experiment had finally concluded here. I walked away with a depleted bank account and a much deeper understanding of the world. As the experiment reached its conclusion, the illusion of the broke lifestyle aesthetic shattered completely. I discovered that while some hacks provided minor relief, they were fundamentally incapable of replacing a living wage or addressing the structural barriers that keep people trapped in cycles of debt. My social media feed, once filled with optimistic life hacks, now felt like a cruel mockery of the genuine hardship faced by millions of people struggling every single day. I realized that the viral advice I had followed was designed for engagement rather than survival, often ignoring the hidden costs of time, health, and the loss of human dignity. The experiment ended not with a triumphant financial breakthrough, but with a profound realization about the deep inequality embedded in our society. I walked away with a depleted bank account and a renewed sense of urgency, understanding that true financial security requires systemic change rather than the performative austerity I had so naively attempted to master during these 30 days. The spreadsheet that once felt like a tool for empowerment now looked like a ledger of my own ignorance. I stared at the final numbers, realizing that no amount of coupon clipping could bridge the gap between a stagnant minimum wage and the rising cost of basic existence. Every dented can of beans in my pantry served as a silent reminder of the hours I spent hunting for savings that barely moved the needle forward. The shared room, once a quirky experiment in communal living, felt claustrophobic and entirely unsustainable. My roommates, unlike me, were not performing a social experiment. They were simply trying to survive another month without falling into the abyss of homelessness or crushing, inescapable debt. I felt a wave of shame wash over me for ever thinking that poverty could be gamified or optimized through clever digital shortcuts or life hacks shared by wealthy influencers. The internet, which I had treated as a library of wisdom, now appeared as a vast echo chamber of privilege that fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of true systemic economic struggle. I packed my few belongings, feeling the weight of the last month pressing down heavily. My body was exhausted from the constant walking, the poor nutrition, and the relentless stress. I looked at my phone, the screen glowing with notifications of new hacks and tips. I deleted the apps, no longer able to stomach the performative nature of the content. The reality of poverty is not a puzzle to be solved with a clever spreadsheet. It is a wall of structural barriers that no individual effort can hope to dismantle. I walked out into the city, seeing the streets through a completely different, clearer lens. The people I passed were not characters in a story, they were individuals fighting battles. I realized that my experiment had been a luxury I could afford to walk away. They did not have that luxury, and that distinction was the most painful lesson learned. My bank account was empty, but my perspective had been irrevocably altered by the experience. True security is not found in frugality, but in a society that values human life. I felt a burning need to advocate for change, to move beyond these superficial fixes. The experiment was over, but the work of understanding the systemic issues had just begun. I stood on the sidewalk, watching the city pulse with a rhythm I finally understood. It was a rhythm of struggle, of resilience, and of a deep, quiet, persistent hope. I took a deep breath, ready to leave the performative austerity behind for something real. The sun set behind the skyline, casting long shadows over the city I once knew. I was no longer the person who started this journey 30 days ago, that much. I was changed, humbled, and finally awake to the harsh realities of our modern world. The spreadsheet was closed, the experiment finished, and the truth remained clear and very loud. We need more than hacks. We need a fundamental shift in how we treat people. I walked toward home, leaving the illusion of the broke lifestyle behind in the dust. The path ahead was uncertain, but I knew that silence was no longer an option. I would carry the lessons of these 30 days with me for the rest of life. They were not just numbers on a page, but the lived reality of many people. I reached my apartment door, feeling the weight of the world on my tired shoulders. Inside, the room was quiet, but my mind was racing with thoughts of future action. I sat down at the table, looking at the empty space where my spreadsheet lived. It was time to turn this realization into something that could actually help others survive. The experiment was a failure of logic, but a success in terms of human empathy. I closed my eyes, letting the exhaustion of the month finally take its toll now. Tomorrow would be different, because I would be different, and that was the true result. The city lights flickered to life, illuminating the streets where so many were still struggling. I watched from the window, a silent witness to the beauty and pain of life. The experiment had ended, but my commitment to the truth had only just begun today. I was ready to face the world, with eyes wide open to the real truth.